Booker Taliaferro Washington was a Virginia-born educator and a complex figure who became one of the most influential African-American leaders of his era. Booker Taliaferro Washington, educator, author, and political advisor, was born into slavery in Halesford, Virginia on April 5, 1856. He came from the most humble circumstances imaginable. He had a commanding presence and a gift for oratory. Washington's early years were marked by hardship and an unquenchable thirst for education. He spent his childhood as a slave on a small plantation, never knowing his white father and seeing his mother only briefly in the evenings after her long days of labor in the plantation kitchen. His education there would come entirely through his own determination, though his later career would test those lessons in the most profound ways imaginable. After emancipation came in 1865, Washington's family moved to Malden, West Virginia, where his stepfather had found work in the salt furnaces. Young Booker was immediately put to work, first in the salt furnaces and later in the coal mines. These were brutal occupations for a child, but Washington was determined to educate himself. He taught himself to read and attended school whenever he could, often before dawn or after his work shift ended. It was during this time that Washington began developing his ideas about education and self-improvement. In 1872, at the age of 16, Washington set out for Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute in Virginia. He had heard about the school from miners and was determined to attend. He traveled the 500 miles mostly on foot, arriving dirty and penniless. The head teacher, skeptical of this ragged boy, told him to sweep a classroom. Washington swept the room 3 times and dusted it 4 times. He was admitted to the school on a work-study basis, paying his tuition by working as a janitor. Washington's years at Hampton were transformative. The school was led by General Samuel Chapman Armstrong, a white man who believed that African Americans needed practical education in trades and agriculture rather than classical liberal arts education. Armstrong's philosophy would profoundly influence Washington's own educational approach. Washington absorbed not only academic knowledge but also Armstrong's belief that African Americans must prove themselves worthy of equality through hard work, cleanliness, and moral character. He graduated with honors in 1875, delivering the commencement address to an audience that included wealthy Northern philanthropists who would later become important supporters of his work. After graduating from Hampton, Washington returned to Malden where he taught school for 3 years. He was a demanding teacher who insisted on cleanliness, punctuality, and proper behavior as much as academic achievement. He also attended Wayland Seminary in Washington, D.C. for a brief period, but he found the classical education there less practical than Hampton's approach. In 1879, General Armstrong invited Washington to return to Hampton to teach and to supervise the Indian students who were being educated there. This experience further shaped Washington's views on education and race relations. He saw education as the key to advancement for all disadvantaged peoples. In 1881, Washington received the opportunity that would define his life's work. The Alabama state legislature had appropriated money for a school for African Americans in Tuskegee, and General Armstrong recommended Washington to head the new institution. Washington arrived in Tuskegee in June 1881 to find that there was no school, no building, and no land, only the legislative appropriation for teachers' salaries. He had been given a mission but no resources to accomplish it. The challenge was enormous, but Washington was undaunted. He borrowed money to purchase an abandoned plantation outside of town and opened Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute on July 4, 1881 with 30 students in a shanty donated by a local church. Washington's vision for Tuskegee was ambitious and specific. The school would teach practical skills, agricultural techniques, and trades alongside basic academic subjects. Students would build the school themselves, learning construction, carpentry, and other trades in the process. They would grow their own food, learning scientific agriculture. They would make bricks, forge iron, and manufacture items the school needed. This approach served multiple purposes. It kept costs low, taught valuable skills, and instilled the work ethic and self-reliance that Washington believed essential for African American advancement. Critics would later charge that this approach prepared students only for menial labor, but Washington believed it provided the foundation for economic independence. The early years at Tuskegee were marked by constant struggle. Washington spent much of his time traveling throughout the North, speaking to churches, philanthropic organizations, and wealthy individuals to raise money for the school. He proved to be a gifted fundraiser, able to convince skeptical white donors that investing in African American education was both morally right and practically beneficial to the South's economic development. His ability to speak to white audiences in terms they could accept while still advancing his people's interests became his trademark approach. The school grew steadily. By 1888, Tuskegee owned 540 acres of land and had an enrollment of over 400 students. Washington had assembled a talented faculty and developed a comprehensive curriculum that combined academic instruction with industrial training. In 1882, Washington married Fannie Norton Smith, a fellow Hampton graduate who taught at Tuskegee. She died in 1884, leaving him with a young daughter. In 1885, he married Olivia Davidson, who had been instrumental in helping him establish Tuskegee. She served as lady principal of the school and was his partner in building the institution. She died in 1889, leaving Washington with 3 children. In 1893, he married Margaret Murray, another talented educator who would support his work for the rest of his life. These personal losses marked Washington deeply, but he channeled his grief into even greater dedication to his work. Throughout the 1890s, Washington's influence grew beyond Tuskegee. He became a sought-after speaker on race relations and education. White leaders in the South and North increasingly saw him as the voice of African Americans, though many African Americans themselves had different views. Washington's message was carefully calibrated to appeal to white audiences while still advocating for African American advancement. He emphasized economic progress over political rights, accommodation over confrontation, and gradual improvement over immediate equality. This approach would eventually generate fierce controversy within the African American community. The defining moment of Washington's public career came on September 18, 1895, when he delivered a speech at the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta, Georgia. He was the only African American speaker at the opening ceremonies, addressing an audience that included white political and business leaders from across the South and nation. The speech he delivered, which became known as the Atlanta Compromise, articulated his philosophy of race relations and made him instantly famous. Washington urged African Americans to remain in the South, to work hard, to learn trades and agriculture, and to prove themselves worthy through economic success rather than political agitation. He told white Southerners that they could depend on African Americans for loyal labor and should invest in their education and economic development. The most famous and controversial passage of the speech used the metaphor of a hand. Washington said that in all things purely social, the races could be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. This acceptance of social segregation while advocating economic cooperation became the cornerstone of what critics called the Atlanta Compromise. White audiences, both North and South, enthusiastically embraced the speech. They saw Washington as a reasonable African American leader who accepted the racial status quo while working for gradual improvement. Northern philanthropists opened their checkbooks. Southern politicians praised him as an example of the right kind of African American leadership. President Grover Cleveland wrote him a letter of congratulation. However, not all African Americans celebrated the Atlanta speech. Many educated African Americans, particularly in the North, saw Washington's acceptance of social segregation and his de-emphasis of political rights as a betrayal. They believed he was asking African Americans to accept second-class citizenship in exchange for vague promises of economic opportunity. These critics would grow more vocal in the years to come, but in 1895, Washington's star was ascending. Following the Atlanta speech, Washington became the most powerful African American in the country. He advised presidents on African American appointments and policies. Theodore Roosevelt consulted him regularly and even invited him to dinner at the White House in 1901, an event that caused a scandal in the South. Washington controlled access to philanthropic funding for African American institutions. He influenced African American newspapers through subsidies and advertising. His approval could make or break the career of an aspiring African American leader. Washington used this power to build what came to be called the Tuskegee Machine, a network of supporters, institutions, and newspapers that promoted his philosophy and opposed his critics. He was not above using underhanded tactics to silence opposition. He secretly funded newspapers that attacked his critics. He used his influence with philanthropists to cut off funding to institutions that opposed him. He worked behind the scenes to undermine leaders who challenged his approach. This ruthless exercise of power contradicted his public image as a humble educator focused only on serving his people. The contradiction between Washington's public accommodation to white supremacy and his private efforts to fight it was profound. While publicly accepting segregation and disfranchisement, Washington secretly funded legal challenges to discriminatory laws. He contributed money to fight peonage cases and railroad segregation. He worked behind the scenes to oppose disfranchisement campaigns. He even funded anti-lynching investigations. These activities were kept secret because Washington knew that if white supporters discovered them, his influence and funding would disappear. The most sustained criticism of Washington came from W.E.B. Du Bois, a brilliant scholar and activist who had initially supported Washington but grew increasingly critical of his approach. In 1903, Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk, which included an essay titled Of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others that systematically critiqued Washington's philosophy. Du Bois argued that Washington's program asked African Americans to give up political power, civil rights, and higher education in exchange for economic opportunities that never materialized. He charged that Washington's leadership had coincided with the disfranchisement of African Americans, the legal establishment of segregation, and the withdrawal of aid for higher education. Du Bois acknowledged Washington's accomplishments but argued that his philosophy was leading African Americans toward permanent inferiority. The conflict between Washington and Du Bois represented a fundamental debate about strategy and philosophy. Washington believed that African Americans must first establish economic independence and prove themselves capable before demanding political and social equality. He thought that confrontational demands for rights would provoke white backlash and make conditions worse. Du Bois believed that without political power and civil rights, economic progress was impossible and that accepting inequality, even temporarily, was morally wrong and practically foolish. This debate would continue long after both men were gone, shaping African American political thought for generations. In 1905, Du Bois and other Washington critics formed the Niagara Movement, which demanded immediate civil rights and rejected Washington's accommodationist approach. Washington used his influence to undermine the movement, denying it funding and media coverage. The Niagara Movement struggled and eventually dissolved, but it laid the groundwork for the NAACP, which was founded in 1909 with Du Bois as a key leader. Despite the controversy surrounding his philosophy, Washington continued to build Tuskegee into a major institution. By 1900, the school had over 1,000 students and a faculty of nearly 100. The campus included dozens of buildings, all built by students. The school taught over 30 trades and had a significant agricultural research program. Washington recruited talented faculty, including the brilliant scientist George Washington Carver, who joined Tuskegee in 1896 and revolutionized Southern agriculture through his research on crop rotation and alternative crops. Washington also established the National Negro Business League in 1900 to promote African American entrepreneurship. The organization held annual conventions that brought together African American business owners from across the country. Washington believed that economic success would earn respect and gradually break down racial barriers. The Business League promoted his philosophy of self-help and economic development. Washington was also a prolific author. His autobiography, Up From Slavery, published in 1901, became a bestseller and was translated into multiple languages. The book told his life story from slavery to success and promoted his philosophy of hard work, self-improvement, and accommodation. It was read by millions and shaped how Americans, both black and white, understood race relations. Washington wrote numerous other books and articles, always promoting his vision of gradual progress through education and economic development. Throughout the early 20th century, Washington maintained his position as the most influential African American leader, but his power gradually eroded. The reality of African American life in the South was not improving as he had promised. Segregation became more entrenched. Violence against African Americans continued unabated. Disfranchisement was complete across the South. Economic opportunities remained limited. The promised rewards for patience and hard work did not materialize. Washington himself experienced the harsh realities of racism despite his fame and influence. In 1911, he was beaten by a white man in New York City after being found in a white neighborhood. The incident was embarrassing and highlighted that even the most famous and accomplished African American could not escape racist violence. Washington's health began to decline in 1915. He had driven himself relentlessly for decades, traveling constantly, speaking, fundraising, and managing Tuskegee. The strain took its toll. In November 1915, while in New York on business, Washington collapsed. Knowing he was dying, he insisted on returning to Tuskegee. He told his doctors that he was born in the South, had lived and labored in the South, and wished to die and be buried in the South. On November 14, 1915, Booker T. Washington died at Tuskegee. He was 59 years old. His death was mourned across the nation. Tributes poured in from presidents, philanthropists, educators, and common people whose lives he had touched. He was buried on the Tuskegee campus he had built from nothing. Washington's legacy is deeply contested. His supporters point to Tuskegee's success, the thousands of students he educated, and his ability to secure resources for African American advancement in an era of virulent racism. They argue that his accommodationist approach was the only practical strategy in the Jim Crow South and that he accomplished more than confrontational approaches could have. His critics argue that his acceptance of segregation and disfranchisement legitimized white supremacy and delayed the civil rights movement. They contend that his emphasis on industrial education limited African American aspirations and that his autocratic control of African American leadership stifled more militant voices. Modern historians recognize that Washington operated in an impossible situation. He had to navigate between white supremacists who wanted to keep African Americans subordinate and African American activists who demanded immediate equality. He chose a path of public accommodation while working privately for change, a strategy that satisfied neither side. His accomplishments were real. Tuskegee became a major institution that educated thousands. He secured millions of dollars for African American education. He created a network of businesses and institutions. Yet his philosophy of accommodation coincided with the nadir of African American rights and may have inadvertently provided cover for white supremacists. Perhaps the most balanced assessment recognizes Washington as a man of his time who did what he thought necessary to advance his people in an era of extreme racism. He built institutions that outlasted him. He educated a generation of African Americans. He proved that African Americans could achieve excellence when given opportunity. Yet his unwillingness to directly challenge segregation and disfranchisement limited what he could accomplish and created the conditions for more militant leadership to emerge after his death. Washington represents a particular type of leader, the accommodationist who works within an unjust system while hoping to gradually transform it. History has produced many such figures. Leaders who compromise with oppression while working for incremental change. Washington's tragedy was that the system he accommodated proved more resilient and more brutal than he anticipated, and the gradual progress he promised did not materialize in his lifetime. In the end, Booker T. Washington was neither a saint nor a sellout, but rather a pragmatic leader who chose a controversial strategy for advancement in impossible circumstances. His legacy includes both Tuskegee Institute and the Atlanta Compromise, both the National Negro Business League and his suppression of dissent. He is remembered today as a complex and controversial figure whose life and work continue to generate debate about strategy, leadership, and the best path toward justice and equality.